And welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast with a special edition. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today from his headquarters outside Memphis, Tennessee, is my good friend Curt Fields. Curt, how are you today?
I'm as fine. They say around here, I'm as fine as frog hair. And
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 I quote you on that now.
the, and the correct response in the colloquialism is you say split three ways. Now that's fine.
That is fine. Well, it's always fine to spend some time with you. Curt is working on a biography of Ulysses S. Grant for the Emerging Civil War series. And as part of that project, we're spending a little bit of time telling Grant's story. So Curt is going to put on his hat as Grant and speak today as Grant as the Army of the Potomac and Burnside's Ninth Corps together head into the Virginia wilderness for what becomes the Overland Campaign. So with that, General Grant, I'd like to welcome you back to the Emerging Civil War podcast, and I look forward to hearing about your adventures in the wilderness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mackowski. It's always good to be back with the ECW folks. Can't think of a better place to be. I'm glad that you've seen fit to come here into the library where we can sit and reason together and talk history.
Well, you have quite a tale to share with us. Expectations are high because you've been brought to the East, as we talked about in our last conversation, promoted to Lieutenant General, and expectations are high because now you're going to make your headquarters with the Army of the Potomac.
Indeed. Now, when I was granted the commission as Lieutenant General, when I was leaving Nashville, Tennessee, Sherman told me, and as I always say, I must needs always say, Sherman said a lot of things that do not bear repeating. I personally have never uttered an oath or a swear word, nor will I ever. But I don't need to because I've got John Rawlins, and I've got Comp Sherman, and all I have to do is say something to spark their temper, and then they go into gales and peals of profanity. That's for a while, it's entertaining. So Sherman, in that kind of a language conveyance, told me essentially, don't make your headquarters in the East. And I reassured him that I had no intention of that because I was going to have my headquarters in either Nashville or Chattanooga, maybe Louisville or Cincinnati, preferably in Tennessee. After I went up there to Washington City and was a part of that circus that is Washington, I decided that, well, the president decided for me. Mr. Lincoln said, I want you to have your headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. He wanted, what he didn't say was he wanted my hand on the reins. Now he told me in our first meeting, and then when I went back a second time, when I went back to Washington to establish my headquarters here and begin my tenure in command of the Army of the Potomac, he said that Mr. Stanton and I have been running this army off and on for 3 years. And he says, some of my decisions have been good. I know that some of them have been bad. But he indicated I've had leadership that I had to step in to prod or to convince or occasionally restrain. And he indicated he didn't feel that way about my leadership. He made it clear the reason that I got that rank, he appointed me to that rank, and that he wanted me with the armies in the Eastern Theater, was that he knew that I was going to engage Lee or whatever part of the Confederacy that I went for, and not let go until one of us was defeated. And that was Mr. Lincoln's desire. The hit and miss across the river, the Rapidan or the Potomac or the Rappahannock or whatever river the AOP, Army of the Potomac, went across to engage Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, it got whomped real good, as they said, and they'd crawl back across the river, rest, refit, change leadership, and repeat that sad process. And that happened, I think, 3 times at least. And Mr. Lincoln knew that I would not do that. And that's what he wanted. Yeah, I think Mr. Lincoln also had a firm grasp on what the numbers of casualties were going to be like. But the numbers of casualties that, as I reminisce today about what happened, yes, the numbers of casualties were horrendous. The nation was shocked to its knees. The weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth was loud across the land. But those numbers, as horrendous as they were, are less numbers than if we had let the war drag on and on, or even worse, had sued for peace and ended the war with the country split asunder. Those two alternatives were not acceptable. Mr. Lincoln wanted me to engage and stay engaged until we prevailed. And he made it clear, in fact, in the orders that made me general in chief, it says, with emphasis added, with headquarters in the field. So there was no question but that I was going to be there. When I went back to Nashville, Tennessee, and met with Sherman, I told him what I've just told you, and told him I've got to be in the East. I don't want to be there, but I've got to be there because a lesser man would knuckle under to the trading politicians and the pressures of that office, and it would become political. And that could not happen because Mr. Lincoln's administration was not going well. He was facing, in the not too distant future, a re-election. He'd already lost the midterm majority in the midterm elections that he had. The war was not going well, and I knew where I had to be. And in that meeting with Sherman, he brought some other fellows with him, and this begins my concerns about what I was going to have to deal with. Sherman came to Nashville. He brought John Logan, and he brought Grenville Dodge, and he brought James McPherson. Now, those are 4 men: Dodge, McPherson, Sherman, and Logan are 4 men whom I deeply trust, and I was at my most ease. I could light a cigar and listen to them, for they gave me good counsel. They were good men, and they gave me good counsel that I knew I could rely on, even though, and I want to point out, that Logan and Dodge were political appointees. Now, Dodge was a railroad engineer who he built them, he didn't drive them, and was also had become the director of my espionage network. He told me he had more than 100 men and women as spies, even some children, as I understand. But when I asked him who they were, he said, "You don't have any business knowing." And Dodge was comfortable enough to tell me that. You don't need to know who my spies are. Nobody knew who Grenville Dodge's spies were except Grenville Dodge. And he carried that to his grave. Logan was unquestionably the most successful political appointee who became a general officer of all of the 178 that President Lincoln appointed. Of course, McPherson's West Point trained, and Sherman was West Point trained. And we met for a long time there talking about what to do next in the prosecution of the war in the Western Theater. And I named him the division director, the regional commander, and moved up McPherson into Sherman's command of the Army of the Tennessee. And Logan and Dodge were both in sync with what Sherman and McPherson wanted. And I knew that I was leaving the Western Theater in good hands. We next left, I left, that was on May the 17th. Sherman and I went up to Cincinnati. I was going back to Washington City. Sherman went with me, and we stopped at Cincinnati and holed up in a hotel. I don't recall which one it was now, but for 2 days, we pored over maps, and the room was full of cigar smoke, and we planned what was going to be done for the last, as it turned out, the last year of the war. And Sherman characterized it, to my amusement later, when he was queried about, well, what were the plans? When Grant went to Washington, what were the plans? And Sherman said, I was to go after Joe Johnston, and he was going after Bobby Lee. Now that, in 2 phrases, was the battle plan for the last year of the war. And then I went on back. I returned up to Washington City and went out to Culpeper Courthouse and began working with Meade. Now, it's at this juncture, in relating what was done or not done, I have to express to you my deep concerns about what I was working with, or perhaps I should better say whom I was working with. In the Western Theater for the last 3 years, I have worked with men, as I just named, those 4 fellows, Logan, Dodge, Sherman, McPherson, and many, many others, all the way down low into the ranks. And I knew those men. I knew who could do what and who couldn't do what, and I could assign whom to what job they did best. Going into the Eastern Theater with the Army of the Potomac, I didn't know anybody. When we would meet with people, it's a handshake and an introduction. And for many of them, it was the first time I'd ever met them. And I frequently would ask me, who was that fellow? Tell me who he was again. And occasionally I mistook people for someone else. All of that to say, I didn't know who I was dealing with. But I also knew that the president wanted action quickly. He wanted it right now, because things aren't going well for him, and the war's got to end. Just a humanitarian approach. The war's got to end. The Confederacy is having great success in all they have to do to win is not lose. And they're doing very well at that. The war, the prolonging of the war could be fatal to the country. So I'm under a great deal of pressure to get the Army together and move on Lee. Now, I don't know anybody. I'm having to learn people. I'm having to structure a command. First thing that happens, I've got Burnside. Well, as you will know, Burnside had been commander of the Army of the Potomac. Here and after, I think, as the lawyers will say, I think I'm going to refer to it as the AOP. That's much easier if that's all right with you. Burnside had been a commander of the AOP, didn't want it, and then when he got it, progressively and quickly demonstrated why he shouldn't have it, and was removed from command. However, he ranked Meade. So I've got the AOP and I've got Burnside. And I'm trying to juggle those 2 military political balls in the air without offending either man. So I determined what we're going to do is Burnside is going to have an independent command. That's okay. Got his own army over there for like 4 divisions, as I recall, but he's got his own army. And I'm going to deal with him and he with me directly. And I was in hopes that would work. With Meade, remember, I had that purgatory of command with the commanding officer in the camp with you after Shiloh, when Halleck came down he got on the field at Petersburg Landing on April the 11th of 62, just 3 days after the battle, 4 days. And I was promptly shuttled to the back. In fact, I made the complaint that I could have been, even though I was in the middle of the camp, I could have been at the furthest reaches of my command and been just as effective. And in fact, I asked 3 different times to be removed. And that went from April the 11th to July the 15th, when Halleck went to Washington City and I resumed command of the Army of the Tennessee, which I'd never really been removed from. But I was not in command. And I wasn't going to do that to George Meade. And I stressed with George that I'll keep my command out of sight, several miles away from yours. I will issue no orders to the Army except that go through you, or that don't go through you, except in matters of contingency. Now, when something's got to be done right now, I'll issue the order and then tell you about it promptly. Okay, that lasted essentially until the first day of the wilderness. But I'll address that when I get to the first day of the wilderness. I began assembling the command. Now, there were thousands of men and officers who were on furlough. Some of them had been on furlough for months upon months. I canceled all the furloughs. Everybody comes back. There were armies, there were, I think, some 21 different commands across this part of the country, and even further. And I consolidated commands and reduced commands and brought all those men back to become combatants in the AOP. There were 100 generals. As I recall, there were 100, very close to that, generals who were not serving. Most of them were too old to be in the field. And I appealed to the president that these men be released from the service. Mr. Lincoln was in sympathy with the concept, but would not go with the idea, because he's got to have the political realm in consideration at all times. Looking at that election down the road in the foreseeable future, he couldn't cut people out of the service, offend them, and send them home and have them campaign, an angry person campaigning against him. So they stayed on the rolls. Well, that's an obstacle that I simply had to live with. I reduced all the batteries around Washington City by the thousands. It was the most heavily fortified city in the world. And I understand why, but they didn't need that many. There were men who spent the 3 years of the war sitting in those camps, living a pretty good life. You know, not to say that it was a comfortable, glorious life, but they were in the Army and living there in Washington City. That came to an end for many of them, which resulted in my first fight, which was not with the Confederacy. It was with Secretary of War Stanton. He saw the numbers where I had reduced in the defenses of Washington, and he said, "You can't do that." And he comes to me and said, "You can't do that." And I said, "I believe I outrank you in that matter." And he said, "Well, we'll see. We'll go to the president." And I said, "Why don't we go to the president? I think that's a good idea." So we went to the president, and he blustered and blew and spouted and vented. And Mr. Lincoln, with that lanky carpenter rule unfolded figure of his with his white socks and slippers, listens to Mr. Stanton. And he noticed, he told me later, that I was just smiling and looking off in another direction. I was silent during all of this. And he when Stanton finally wore out, I think it's more of that than he said all he had to say, because he's capable of saying a great deal. Mr. Lincoln said, "Well, Mr. Stanton, you know," as he's picking at his fingernails, he said, "You know, you and I have tried to run this war for 3 years, and we haven't done a real good job of it. Now, we brought Mr. Grant, as Mrs. Grant calls him, over the mountains here to command this army. And you know, Mr. Secretary, I really think we ought to let him run this army. Let him do what he feels fit." And of course, that was a shock to Secretary Stanton, but he blustered in a rump, turned apoplectic and so forth. But I did prevail. Now, I will say that once I left Washington, I sent a number of those men in the defenses around Washington. I sent some back, as much to appease Stanton as anything else. I didn't hurt my numbers, but I did send some back because I thought I can salve some wounds here. I wanted to consolidate the Army and to expand it. And I brought it up to, I had the AOP at about 100,000. And then when you count Burnside's independent command, I had about 120,000 men. When I got off the cars there coming back up for my launch to build the Army, after I'd met with Sherman and so forth, I met Rufus Ingalls. Now, I hadn't seen Rufus Ingalls, now General Rufus Ingalls, my quartermaster. He and I went to the point together. And I hadn't seen Rufus since my days at Fort Vancouver, back in the Oregon Territory. And he's a tremendous quartermaster. In fact, the house I lived in, which is still there, was a prefabricated house that was built in Boston, disassembled, shipped around the Horn, and reassembled at Fort Vancouver. So I lived in the first modular prefabrication housing, to my knowledge. That's Rufus Ingalls. And I was pleased. It was hail fellow well met, and I was pleased to see Rufus. We had a backslapping, handshaking, good visit. Well, some time passes when I'm doing all this and pulling in men and consolidating and sparring with Secretary Stanton. I'm in the field, and Rufus sent word to me that he wanted to meet me. Well, in dealing with the predecessors in the AOP command, he knew about the protocol that was in extant at the time. He put on his dress uniform. He got in the finest Army wagon that he could find, and he was riding to my headquarters to meet me. Well, as it were, I was out and it's raining. I was out going somewhere, and our paths crossed. And Ruth said, "Grant, I need to talk to you." And I said, "Well, let's talk right here." To his astonishment, so I got off my horse, and we were walking up and down the road, and it had started raining pretty hard by then. But Ruth and I walked up and down the road, stood there in the rain, and he told me what he needed. And I said, "Good, do what you need to do." Gave him permission, issued the order. And I said, I need to be about my business. I remounted my horse, and he got back in the wagon, and I believe he's still shocked about that. Well, he saw the change in command. So we're pulling all this together, and I'm looking. Oh, I want to say too, it just occurred to me. Let me backtrack a moment. When we were meeting in Nashville there on March the 17th, 18th, the mayor of Galena, Illinois, came to Nashville to present me with a ceremonial sword. And it had 14 diamonds in the hilt and a gold scabbard, gold-plated scabbard, with the engraving of all the battles that I had won. And he made quite the speech. And a crowd of ceremony was established for this. And he gives me this beautiful diamonds in the hilt, gold-plated, so forth, sword. And Sherman described it. He said, "Grant looked very uncomfortable." And when the mayor of Galena got through speaking and turned to Grant fumbled first in his coat pocket, then in his waistcoat pockets, and fished through both trouser pockets, and finally pulled out a scrap of paper. It was a cartridge paper that he had written in pencil some comments. Now, you can think now when you look back on it, I didn't say much if it's on cartridge paper. And I stammered and mumbled what I had to say, that was in. So I got a presentation sort of while I was in Nashville meeting. But to get back to preparing to meet Lee, I'm looking across the Rapidan River. Now, as you're looking, wherever you're looking, you can picture standing on the bank of the Rapidan and looking to the south there. And there's Clark Mountain, and it's about 700 feet high. It's a little back from the river. And Lee is on top of Clark Mountain. And I'm looking at either to your right to go through some open territory and swing down around to Lee's left, which would be, I could have railroad supply, but I'm still burned about that fiasco back in December of '62 when Earl Van Dorn burned all my supplies. And I realized, don't depend on a railroad, because one railroad wasn't going to carry all the supplies I needed. So I was going to have wagon support anyway. As the further I went, the more men would be required to guard that railroad. And I wasn't going to do that. If I went to my left around Lee's right, I could head toward Richmond. Now, Richmond was not really a target. My target was Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And if I got to Richmond, that'd be good, of course. But it's the fighting from crossing the Rapidan to the Richmond that I was wanting. I wanted to get Lee out and meet me and give me battle and fight and wear him down. Every Confederate soldier that was taken out of combat, killed or wounded or captured, is one that's going to be very hard for Lee to replace. Now, he was still getting reinforcements, but he'd been told from Richmond that that well's pretty much dry. And we're 3 years into the war. Conscription is conscripted. Nearly every man and boy I think they were conscripting from 14 now to 60. And his well was drying up. Every soldier I could take out of the field was somebody he couldn't replace. So I wanted to engage him, and if I could get Richmond, well, that'd be fine. But to do that, I first got to go through the wilderness, second growth timber, been that way for decades, overgrown timber with a thick canopy. So it was always, in much of it, it was always gloomy and dark. The sun never hit the ground in a lot of it. 6 miles by 12 miles, I think, is the dimensions. Roads are narrow, not many roads in it. Not good for artillery to pass through. Cavalry would be virtually useless in there. In fact, once we began crossing the river, I sent back a lot of our artillery because it was slowing us down. I reduced what officers could carry, reduced the number of wagons that we could carry, did everything to make the army move faster and more quickly. And I decided to go to my left around Lee's right and go through the wilderness. Now, I decided that because I could get supplies from the rivers as I went toward Richmond, but also I didn't think that Lee would hit me in the wilderness. I was convinced that Robert E. Lee would not hit me. Now, I knew his numbers were about 65,000. I'm thinking, as I recall, the best numbers that I think I got were that he had about 60 to 65,000 troops. I had 120,000. So I outnumber Lee 2-1. And I didn't think that he'd hit me in the wilderness. I know Joe Hooker's come to grief there in that area, but I didn't think Lee'd hit me. So I thought my best move is to go through the wilderness. And I thought we'll move quickly enough that we'll get through the wilderness before Lee can hit me. Yep, yes, sir, that's what we'll do. I didn't tell anybody when the move was going to be, but it was obvious that we were gathering. From what I'm told now from their side of it, they could be on Clark's Mountain, or they're looking across the river, and all these thousands of campfires everywhere. They knew something was going to happen. Lee knew I was coming after him. And as this buildup is coming to a head and ready to move, two things happen, some anecdotes here. Lee's up on top of that mountain and he's looking, and it was a gamble for him. He hasn't faced me nor I him. My attitude was he puts his britches on one leg at a time like I do. Lee did not worry me. I was prepared to come to grips with him. Lee knew of my record, but he wasn't, I certainly don't think he was worried about me. He was not disdainful of me, but he felt like I'm going to do the same thing. All those six other people, I think it's 7 if you count George McClellan twice. Now George certainly does. But while I'm not in command of the AOP, essentially I became commander of the AOP before the Overland campaign was completed. But he thought that I was going to do as all the others had done. So he said, though, I'm told, that he pointed down to his right and he said at the 2 forts, Germanna Ford there, he said he will cross there. And a little bit of a gamble, but he knew what I would do. He fathomed that. He had good perception of me. And the other anecdote I would tell you is, I understand, Longstreet has told me this. He got news, or he had heard there in a meeting, and he's just described as one of the younger officers on Lee's staff there. And he said something to the effect of, well, we're going to give him a good spanking and send him back across the river, Grant back across the river, just like we've done all the rest of them. And Longstreet bristled at this because, we've been longtime friends since the academy. Longstreet got me through French at the military academy. I would not have completed the academy if it hadn't been for Pete Longstreet tutoring me through French. And we've been good friends, the best of friends since, and have been since the war. But Longstreet bristled at this, and he said, do you know Grant? And the officer said, well, no, disdainfully, no, I don't. What of it? Something like that effect. And Longstreet said, well, I do know Grant. I do know him. And I will tell you, sir, that we had better husband our resources. We had best put a musket in the hands of every man that we can get. And we'd best put him on the ramparts and watch Grant, because Grant is going to fight. That man, as you have expressed him disrespectfully, that man is going to fight us. He's going to fight us every hour of every day until this war is over. That's what that man is going to do. And Pete said this young man was taken aback, but didn't change his opinion of me. And Longstreet said, I knew you would, and you did, but we were preparing to cross. I hadn't told, or cross the Rapidan, I had told no one, not even Halleck. And I finally, as we're getting ready to move, I told him we're going to begin moving on May the 2nd. So the 120,000 men began moving toward Germanna Ford there, and there were 2 bridges there, and we built 3 more pontoon bridges. And the Army began to slowly lift itself up and creep toward the embarkation point, which was to be May the 4th. And late on May the 4th, evening of May the 4th into May the 5th, or May 3rd into May the 4th, we began moving. at about 10 o'clock in the morning. Oh, and I should say too that Burnside was going to be the rear guard reserve and come across. We sent the cavalry across. I had named Sheridan cavalry commander of the cavalry corps because I got tired of Bedford Forrest whipping every Yankee cavalry unit. And Halleck suggested Phil Sheridan, and I said, just the man I want. So we took an infantry commander, demonstrably successful man, and put him in command of the cavalry. Cavalry goes across the river first, cleared out the Confederate pickets. The army begins to cross. Now, I should also tell you at this point that we had the wagons and the logistics of moving. We had 4,300 wagons and of supplies. We had 835 ambulances, which ironically carried medical supplies and ammunition. What an irony. But 835 ambulances. We had 56,000 horses and mules, 23,000 mules. The other horses were wagons, artillery, and cavalry. But 56,000 animals. And of course, we had cavalry and we had artillery, much of which I sent back. But the wagon train, had it been mule to wagon, would have stretched more than 90 miles. And the first wagon would have been rolling into the Richmond city limits when the last wagon was still in Washington City. 120,000 men. I meant business. And I crossed about 10 o'clock in the morning on the 4th. And it was noted, I think Porter noted, that I had put on for the first time he'd ever seen me, well, since Chattanooga. I think I had a sash and saber on then for an occasion, but I had on my sash and my saber, and my coat was completely buttoned up, and I was on a knoll there beside one of the bridges, and the men were marching. Their heads were about even with our feet. And I had Elihu Washburn, my congressman, with me. And the people describing it said they'd never seen me dressed like this, and it was unusual for me to do that because I hate wearing a sword or dressing up. And they surmised that I knew the dignity of the situation. And one of my staff, I think it was Lyman, said, "Wouldn't it be interesting if every man who was going to be killed or wounded had a badge or insignia on his breast as he marched by?" And I said, yes, I guess that would be. As it turned out, about half of them would have had one of those badges on. And Washburn's got his congressman black suit on, and one of the fellows, you know, the soldiers with the military sense of humor, when they know you can't figure out who said it, as they're walking by, one of them said, "Well, there sits Ulysses Grant himself." And the other one of his buddies walking with him said, "Yeah, and he's got his own damned undertaker with him." Washburn, I think, took some note of that. But we watched them march, and then I went into camp a little further back away from the river. I decided to wait until all of the army was across the river. Now, in retrospect, I'm criticized for that, but I don't have any problems with that then or now. I was too strung out, and I thought I knew time is valuable. Time not well used accrues credit to the enemy he did not earn, and Lee took advantage of this time. But I wanted to get all of my wagons across the river, all of the army, and then get Burnside across the river so we're all together and we'd move through the wilderness in a unit rather than be strung out. Lee decided, as we started moving on the morning of the 5th, Lee decided to hit me. Now, I had telegraphed Halleck and said, we're across the river and moving the next 48 hours, we'll know something. Well, even as the telegraph keys are being tapped, Lee's already hitting me. And we were moving south, and the plan was to move in and cover the two roads that were running east and west into Fredericksburg. And we were going south, and I went to the Wilderness Tavern. Hancock is supposed to be coming up. Warren is taking a position there, and Sedgwick comes in, and Sedgwick is nearest the river. And then you got Warren, and we got the Orange Turnpike. South of that, we got the Orange Plank Road. Well, Lee decides to hit us on both of those, and the fighting was savage all day. Here begins my awareness of who could do what. Hancock was late. Hancock the Superb was not superb that first day in the wilderness. And although he performed well the second day when he got to the Brock Road and Orange Plank Road intersection, our southernmost point there at that time in those first 2 days, Warren was hesitant. Early in the morning, almost daylight, 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, he's looking down that Orange Plank or that Orange Turnpike, and he sees Ewell down there with about half of Lee's army. And he's ordered to move. He doesn't move until I think it was 1 o'clock that afternoon. By the time he moved, when he's got Sedgwick with him, Burnside has been ordered to come over. He diddles the day away. And Ewell is using that time to put in artillery, bring up his troops. And so by the time Warren moved, what had been an open field to dash across with little resistance became a killing field with artillery and a strong Confederate force. And Lee is there. Now, so I saw what Warren would do. Sedgwick comes in, and he's nearest the river. Well, by the end of the day, Sedgwick, and he's a good man. He was a good man. He was killed just a few days later. But Sedgwick was a good man. However, his troops had gone into camp. And General Gordon, on the other side with Ewell, has scouts, and he finds out that their left, our far right, near the river, Sedgwick is in camp. They've already stacked arms, cooking their dinner. And Gordon's telling Ewell all day, all afternoon, certainly, let me go hit him. And Ewell wouldn't do it. By the evening, end of the day, he tells Lee when Lee came up, and Lee said, by all means, hit him. So they stormed into Sedgwick's troops and rolled them up for a pretty good distance. They managed to stem the flow, and by this time, darkness comes. So at the end of the day, Sedgwick was able to save the day. A lot of good men died unnecessarily because Warren did not attack when he was ordered. And as the morning wore on that first day, I'm telegraphing and sending messengers all up and down the line saying, I'm not hearing anything from Warren. Who knows? Who can tell me about Warren? Well, Warren wasn't doing anything. So Governor K. Warren disappointed me. Down the southern point of all of this front activity with the Orange Plank Road, Lee is waiting for Longstreet to come. Well, Longstreet's having to come 25, 30 miles, as I recall. And he's late getting there. Well, all these troops, he doesn't make it the first day. So at the end of the day, on the 5th, we've got the southern road, Orange Plank Road, and the Brock Road intersection, which is a linchpin to all of this movement, is still in our control. But Longstreet's come on the field. He comes on the field the next morning. And we got Longstreet and all the corps that he had. But he also has one of his officers who knew the area, many of them did. He knew the area that paralleled, there's a railroad cut that paralleled the Plank Road. And he tells Longstreet, so they file in and they hit. Hancock makes it. He's made it overnight. And he's in a strong position. He begins to attack, and they start to rolling the Confederates back. And then here comes Longstreet out of the railroad cut to Hancock's immediate left flank. And as Hancock put it and told Longstreet, you rolled me up like a wet blanket. And it was only by the hardest that they were able to staunch that flow. So by the end of the second day, the blood is knee deep by then, and we're at something of a stalemate. Well, Lee falls back about a half a mile, and we had dug in, secured our positions. But that morning of the 6th, I had already decided we've had enough of this, and I sent out orders to move out overnight, and but don't issue the orders until 3 p.m. And I wanted to move the artillery that we had first, and then we back up and begin my sidling, so to speak. I wanted to go to Spotsylvania Courthouse, strategic position, and move out. Well, Sunday, the 7th rather, it's quiet all day. But I moved out that night and headed for Spotsylvania Courthouse. So the Wilderness, the first 2 days are behind us. 18% casualties for Lee and myself both. Horrendous casualties. But I'm heading for Spotsylvania Courthouse. Lee is too. Now that night of the 7th, or the 6th rather, Lee tells Richard Anderson, who is now in command of Longstreet's corps, because Longstreet has been wounded again by his own men, almost in the same place Jackson was a year before. And he tells Richard Anderson, let your men rest and move in the morning. And Anderson said, he looked around and everything's in flames. There's no place to lie down. So they moved on to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and that put him there waiting on our federal contingent to get there. And Lee had beat me to the punch in that area. So for the next 18 days, we fought all around Spotsylvania Courthouse. What I stands out most in my memory is the mule shoe and the bloody angle. And I need to talk about that a moment. About 3/4 of a mile long and about half a mile wide from the semicircle line, long line that Lee had around the high point there at Spotsylvania Courthouse, there was a bulge, a salient in their line that both sides came to call the mule shoe. When we attacked that, of course, it was in the rain, and for about 18 hours, men fought hand-to-hand combat in a pouring rain. Bodies, the dead and wounded, were being pushed down in the mud 8 and 10 deep. That was the horror of that. And they fought essentially to a standstill. And in all of this, Emory Upton, Colonel Upton, young man, comes up with the idea of punching a hole with an arrow-like double column. He did that. He was successful with that, but couldn't get the support he needed, and they had to come back. So I saw that tactic used. Well, Lee finally pulls back and strengthens his line and pulls the mule shoe back. And I decided to move around and again sidle around to the southwest and southeast rather, and went to my next challenge was the North Anna. Well, Lee has thrown a line across the North Anna in a triangular position, and he let Hancock get across the river. And then I found, to my horror, that half my army is on one side and the other half is on the other side, and Lee could have defeated me in detail. But Lee is taken with, I've heard he had an extreme case of diarrhea or stomach trouble. It's said, some folks say he was having a heart attack. And while he kept saying we need to strike those folks a blow, he didn't issue any orders. And I was able to extricate my army back on one side. And again, we moved. I stole a march on Lee, got to the James River, and moved across the James, moved 100,000 men, even had bands playing. And I think that, if I recall, that was on the 13th. Lee realized on the 13th I was gone, had a day on him. And we moved south of the James and began heading for Petersburg. I decided to shift from going for Richmond to Petersburg. Instead of taking Richmond from the north, I'd take him to the south. Now I need to back up a bit and say what was happening while I'm doing battle in the wilderness and around Spotsylvania Courthouse. My initial plan had been everybody moves at once. I was going to have Butler take the Army of the James and secure Petersburg or Richmond. Was going to have Nathaniel Banks and the Army of the Gulf move and take Mobile, and Franz Sigel was going to go into the valley and secure the Shenandoah Valley. Well, Sigel gets whipped at New Market by John Breckinridge. He goes up there, and that's the famous field of lost shoes, and the cadets from VMI fought well. So Sigel's rolled back. He retreats. Banks on, I think, the 16th of May, he gets hit in the Red River campaign. Confederates attack him, and Banks is whipped down there. And I asked for his removal, and President Lincoln said, can't do that. Election coming up. I cannot remove Banks, because Banks had been Congressman, Speaker of the House, briefly Governor of Massachusetts. He couldn't remove Banks. So Banks had to stay a thorn in my paw down there. And about the same day, Butler meets Beauregard and is bottled up at Bermuda 100 between the Appomattox and James Rivers. And he's in a comfortable place, but he's not doing me any good. And I said he was like an army in a jug with a cork in it. So I haven't got Petersburg and I haven't got Richmond. I got an army jugged up. I got an army in Virginia. I got an army in Texas, Louisiana, that's not doing anything. Now, Johnston had been replaced by Hood, but Sherman's doing well with the Army of the Tennessee. There was good news there. But I crossed the James and decided I'm going for Petersburg. And on June the 1st, we headed for Cold Harbor, which is not cold and it's not no water. It's just an old English term for housing where you didn't get any hot food and you could sleep. Cold Harbor. Old Cold Harbor, New Cold Harbor. We were at Cold Harbor. Now, the significance is back in 1962, this is where Lee had whipped McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign. So we got in there and in place there at Cold Harbor, June the 2nd. I wanted to attack on June 2nd. Hancock couldn't make it. Lee is opposite me going into the same lines he had when he whipped McClellan. And he's reinforcing those lines, digging in, hardening his position. We couldn't attack on June the 2nd because Hancock couldn't make it. He gets there, though. Finally, he's got to rest, and I understand that. But Lee had 24 hours from June the 2nd to June 3rd to refit, rebuild, and get in position. And I ordered on the daylight on the 3rd to attack those positions at Cold Harbor. And it was a debacle. 60,000 men get up, rush those positions. And one of them described it. He said it was volcanic. It wasn't just heavy fire, it was volcanic. And we suffered 7,000 casualties that day. Now, the journalists like to say that we suffered 7,000 dead in 30 minutes. No, we didn't suffer 7,000 dead in 30 minutes. The dead and wounded were horrendous. And about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, early afternoon, I ordered the men to come back. Well, frankly, they weren't going to make another assault. That wasn't going to happen, and I knew it. Their commanding officers on the line knew it. So we pulled back. But it was a dark day, and I have regretted that order to attack at Cold Harbor ever since, because it was a horrendous loss of life, killed and wounded, and we gained no military benefit whatever to account for or compensate for what we lost. I regret that decision as much as I regretted the decision to assault at Vicksburg on May 22nd, 1963. And I've been challenged. Why did I do that? I did the same thing with Lee at Cold Harbor that Lee did with Pickett at Gettysburg. I thought on June the 3rd, now we've been fighting across Virginia now since May the 5th. So it's been almost 30 days of nonstop, bloody, savage combat, almost nonstop. And I thought that by this time that the Confederates were fought out, that they were worn out, that they were demoralized. Everything Lee was thinking with Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. And I thought, I'm going to hit them square in the middle of that line and punch through, and we'll take them. I did everything that Lee did with Pickett and had the same results, because just as what the Federal line had done overnight before Lee and Pickett, Lee had done overnight that day that I lost from June 2nd to June 3rd, and was waiting on me. It was a debacle. Well, we for the next few days, we licked our wounds, and I thought, well, we're going to sidle around again. We're going to go for Petersburg. So I send Warren and Hancock down to take Petersburg. Now, Beauregard by now was here. He's whipped Butler and got him jugged up at Bermuda 100. I got maps from Butler in the area, and we decided to move on Petersburg. And Butler has punched at it earlier, went into camp, didn't do anything, didn't pursue it. And it was only, I'm told now, I think 5,400 home guard boys and old men. And Beauregard, it brings in a few troops, and he's only got about 7,000 troops, I understand. And Warren and Hancock is late getting there. And Warren is supposed to attack, I think it was on June the 15th. And he didn't attack in the morning when he was supposed to. He did 4 hours of reconnoitering. And I'm again sending messages, what's happening? What's the result here? But he doesn't move. He didn't attack until 7 o'clock that night. It was almost dark before he attacked, so it's getting dark. And to no avail much, but Hancock got there. They got 35,000 troops against some 7,000 Confederates. They pushed them back about a mile, took 16 guns, I think, and got a half a mile or so of trenches, and they stopped. Didn't do anything the next day. I finally get to the area, and Beauregard, I found out, is telling Lee Grant's whole army is here. He's coming after Petersburg. Lee didn't believe it. He kept sending messages, and I need reinforcements down here, and I'm moving my troops there. I went there the 16th and looked it over. The 17th, we assaulted again and pushed them back a bit, took some more territory, more lines, and pushed Beauregard back a bit. By this time, though, Lee, and it wasn't until Lee's own son had gone down there and inspected and seen what was happening, and goes back and tells his father, Grant's there. You need to be there. So Lee had begun, I think, frantically sending his troops there. And by the morning of the 18th, we were lined up, ready to assault, some fighting. And by this time, though, I see that Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia is firmly in place there at Petersburg. And we had come to a siege. Now, I had finally, in my maneuverings and sidling around, my troops, like, they think I don't hear what they say, but everything in the camp comes under my tent flap. The joke is that Grant would flank the devil out of hell, and I guess I would, but we had sidled and shoe hooked around and gotten Lee there where he couldn't maneuver. And that's Lee's greatest strength, but he couldn't maneuver. And he's locked in place. Now, he didn't want a siege, and neither did I. But as of June the 18th of 1864, we had come at the end of 42 days. My men call it 40 days in hell. By the end of the Overland campaign, we're there at Petersburg, locked in a siege.
And that's probably a good spot for us to stop for today because you spent 9 months at Petersburg. We'll talk about that time in our next conversation together. General Grant, thanks for being with us today.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'm Chris Mackowski on behalf of Curt Fields as Ulysses S. Grant. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.